When reading a book like Michael Sandel's The Tyranny of Merit, one is always surprised to find parallel observations to things observed by, say, Marx in the early Marxist writings on alienations. I know a lot of people try to argue that alienation isn't important to Marx because it's not part of his, quote, scientific project, unquote, because it is subjective. Now, they will often use one form of alienation and not all four forms that are talked about in the political and economic manuscripts. And admittedly, the political economic manuscripts are manuscripts. They weren't published, although you do see the alienation writings going all the way up through and including in Capital itself. But that's a point of Marxology. That's not even in this book. So why am I bringing it up when I read Michael Sandel? Let me get to why. Seen from below, the hubris of elites is galling. No one likes to be looked down upon. Asterisk, and this is me talking. Sandel's right, but we've dealt with hubristic elites and aristocrats for forever. That's part of the justification process of human inequity. What's interesting about meritocracy is how far it takes it in all levels of society. But the meritocratic faith adds insult to injury. The notion that your fate is in your hands, that you can make it if you try, is a double-edged sword, inspiring in one way, but invidious in another. It congratulates the winners, but denigrates the losers, even in their own eyes. For those who can't find work or make ends meet, it is hard to escape the demoralizing thought that their failure is their own doing, though they simply lack the talent and drive to succeed. As a side note, in Werner Sombart 1905 book, Why Americans Won't Become Socialists, which was republished in 1973, I think kind of that timing is important to notice, and I'm going to talk about it when I talk about Sombart directly, which may be before or after when this is released. I'm sorry about that. It is interesting that he notes that trait in Americans in the American working class early on, particularly during the period what we might call now settler colonial expansion, because the availability and wealth taken from land, taken from other groups of people, as a release valve, made it seem like you could do anything if you worked hard enough because you had the resources that have been taken from other people. Back to this point. The politics of humiliation differs in this respect from the politics of injustice. Protest against injustice look outwards. It complains that the system is rigged, that the winners have cheated or manipulated their way to the top. Protest against humiliation is psychologically more freighted. It combines resentment of the winners with nagging self-doubt. Perhaps the rich are rich because they are more deserving than the poor. Maybe the losers are complicit in their own misfortune after all. The feature of the politics of humiliation make it more combustible than other political sentiments. It's a potent ingredient in the volatile brew of anger and resentment that fuels populist protest. Though himself a billionaire, the most rich president to ever sit in the office, the fourth richest to ever run, and he ran theoretically against one of the more rich. One of the ironies of this time period and of politics since Reagan is the populist appeal of people who have no populist background whatsoever. It's not unique, though. We see this in Bonapartist politics going all the way back to Louis Napoleon, so it shouldn't surprise us. Or even in the dynamics of peasants who support kings against other kinds of oligarchs. And in fact, there may be a structural, like almost logical reason for this. We'll come back to that later. Unlike Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton, who spoke constantly of opportunities, Trump scarcely mentions the word. Instead, he offers the blunt talk of winners and losers. Interestingly, Bernie Sanders, a social democratic populist, also rarely speaks of opportunity and mobility, focusing instead on the quality of power and wealth. Elites have so valorized a college degree, both as an avenue for advancement and as a basis for social esteem, they have difficulty understanding the hubris that meritocracy can generate and the harsh judgment it imposes on those who have not gone to college. Such attitudes are at the heart of the populist backlash and Trump's victory. One of the deepest political divides in American politics today is between those with and those without a college degree. As a side note, this is actually one of the rational parts of the PMC thesis that the PMC people who promote it as a class thesis have trouble defining, because it doesn't map on to your power and the production of labor. It doesn't map on even to your actual wealth. It maps on the social prestige. There are many, and you might say, but college degrees are carteling. Well, there are many things that don't require college degrees that have guild-like cartels. No. So there's a lot more going on here, and we need to think about it very carefully. We don't need to think about it in the way that social media pundits who are downstream from other kinds of pundits have kind of vulgarized it. In 2016 election, Trump won 2/3 of white voters with a college degree, while Hillary Clinton was decisively around most voters with advanced degrees. A similar divide appeared in Britain's Brexit referendum. Voters with no college education vote overwhelmingly for Brexit. The vast majority of those with a postgraduate degree voted to remain. And I hear people on the liberal side who talk all the time about how they need to save democracy and how democracy is serious, who also promote this view that, like, well, but if you were educated, you would be on our side. One of the things about education is it moderates against most right-wing and populist opinion, but it also moderates against left-wing opinion, and I could talk about that all day. Yes, there's, all kinds of left professionalism, but actual radicalism tends to be denuded in the academy because the academia has very conservative internal justification walls. I can get to that later. Reflecting on her presidential campaign a year and a half later, Hillary Clinton displayed the meritocratic hubris that contributed to her defeat. I won in places that represent 2/3 of America's gross domestic product, she told a conference in Mumbai, India in 2018. So I won the places that are optimistic, diverse, and dynamic and moving forward. By contrast, Trump drew support from the places that don't like black people getting rights and didn't like women getting jobs. She'd won the voters, the winners of globalization, and Trump had won the losers. The Democratic Party once stood for farmers and working people against the privileged. Now, in the Meritocratic age, its defeated standard bearer boosted that the prosperous and enlightened parts of the country had voted for her. Donald Trump was keenly alive to the politics of humiliation. From the standpoint of economic fairness, his populism is fake, a kind of plutocratic populism. He promoted a health plan that would have cut health care for many of his working class supporters and enacted a tax bill that heaped tax cuts on the wealthy. But he focused solely on the hypocrisy misses the point. When he withdrew the United States from the Paris Climate Change Agreement, Trump argued implausibly that he was doing this to protect American jobs. The real point of his decision, his political rationale, was contained in a seemingly stray remark. At what point does America get demeaned? At what point do they start laughing at us as a country? We don't want other leaders in other countries laughing at us anymore. Liberating the United States from supposed burdens of climate agreement was not really about jobs or global warming. It was in Trump's political imagination about averting humiliation. This resonated with Trump voters, even those who cared about climate change. As a side note, I've also noticed that a lot of the liberal and left liberal talk about the Paris agreements is that, one, even when we do the progressive climate change reform in the Democratic Party, as was snuck into the Anti-Inflation Act last year, it is not even what we agreed to the Paris Accords. And two, the Paris Accords are non-binding and haven't meant shit anyway. The entire thing is symbolic, both in acceptance and rejection. Yes, what the Paris Accords advocate for is of vital importance to human civilization, but how it is being done, carbon trades and captures, this, that, and the other, often that don't show any actual effect. And if Europe is any indication, show that they just all sort the carbon production to some developing country like Russia. And when I call Russia a developing country, I'm not impugning that it's not advanced. In fact, Russia has one of the most educated populations in the world, which itself is disproof of the general meritocratic conception of a lot of these liberals. Let us continue. Taken by itself, the notion that the meritorious should govern is not distinctive to our time. In ancient China, Confucius taught that those who excelled in virtue and ability should govern. In ancient Greece, Plato imagined a society ruled by philosopher kings supported by a public-spirited class of guardians. Aristotle rejected Plato's philosophy king, but he too argued for the meritorious should have a greater influence on public affairs. For him, the merit relevant to governing was not wealth or noble birth, but excellence in civic virtue and phronesis, a practical wisdom to reason well about the common good. The founders of the American Republic called themselves men of merit and hoped virtuous, knowledgeable people like themselves would be elected to office. They opposed hereditary aristocracy, except when it comes to slavery. Just got to add that back in there. But were not keen on direct democracy, which they feel could bring demagogues to power. As a side note, I want to point out, as Abby Hassan did in an episode of Vulgar Complexity with me, for all their anti-democratic impulses, the representatory density of the population at the time meant that representatives actually had closer to a one-to-one relationship to who they were representing. Whereas if you were to proportion out representatives now based on the way they were proportioned in the anti-democratic period of the American Republic, you'd have something like 10,000 congressional representatives. Just you should think about that sometimes. They sought to design institutions such as the indirect direction of the U.S. Senate and the president would enable the meritorious to govern. Thomas Jefferson favored natural aristocracy based on virtue and talent rather than artificial aristocracy based on wealth and birth. This form of government is bet, he wrote, which provides for the pure selection of those natural aresti into the offices of government. Despite their differences, these traditional versions of political meritocracy, from the Confucian to the Platonic to the early Republican, share the notions that merit relevant to governing include moral and civic virtue. This is because they all agree that the common good consists, at least in part, in the moral education of citizens. They disagree on who gets to be a citizen, though. That's a whole other thing. There's parts of this that leftists would point out that Sandel is leaving out, and that's right. Like, that's completely true, and we should keep that in mind. None of these meritocratic distinctions are neutral, and none of them are without ties to wealth and wealth accumulation, even in the ancient form, even in the non-capitalist form. But let's get back to this. Our technocratic vision of meritocracy severs the link between merit and moral judgment. In the domains of the economy, it simply assumes that the common good is defined by GDP, and that the value of people's contributions consists in the market value of goods or services they sell. I've even seen this infect socialists. They read it back into Marx. It's gross. In the domains of government, it assumes that merit means technocratic expertise, instrumental reason, to go back to the Weberian and early Frankfurt School critique of this. This can be seen in the growing world of economists as policy advisors. Bill Gates Foundation having economists do econometric studies on like the efficacy of degrees on teachers and pretending that like knowledge expertise doesn't matter to teaching, which is hilarious when you look at the fact that they weren't looking at what the degrees were in, just if they were higher or not. It's very strange. Bracketing out of crucial information, something that economists do all the time. But it was common and repeated even in the field as good policy, which is kind of nutty to me. The increasing reliance on market mechanisms to define and achieve the public good, I mean, literally a whole lot of people that I know, particularly of the baby boomer and Gen X generation, literally think that what is popular in the market is good because the market is actually the primary epistemic adjudicator of merit. That's crazy to me. And the failure of public discourse to address the large moral and civic questions should be the center of political debate. What should we do about rising inequality? What is the moral significance of national borders? What it makes for the dignity of work? What do we owe one another as citizens? The moral blinkered way of conceiving merit in the public good has weakened democratic societies in several ways. One, it points out that they were never democratic in the first place, but that's a whole other thing. The first is the most obvious. Over the past 4 decades, meritocratic elites have not governed very well. The elites who governed the United States from 1940 to 1980 were far more successful. They won World War II. They helped rebuild Europe and Japan. They strengthened the welfare state. They dismantled segregation and presided over 4 decades of economic growth, which flowed from rich to poor alike. This is Sandel describing the Fordist Social Compact. And while the Fordist Social Compact was very different, I mean, you know, Lash is writing about the people it produces towards the end of it in the culture of narcissism. And the reason why he talks about that, expounds that in the middle himself, is this isn't even a choice. This is what he says is a natural logic of this kind of hegemony. Their children, while more educated, are less effective, even though they are far more brutally effective than many of the outsiders who chastise them. By contrast, the elites who have governed the United States since have brought us 4 decades of stagnant wages for most workers, inequalities of income and wealth not seen since the 1920s, the Iraq War, a 19-year inconclusive war in Afghanistan. This was written right before Biden ended it. Financial deregulation, the financial crisis of 2008, a decaying infrastructure, the highest incarceration rate in the world, a system of canine finance and gerrymandering congressional districts that makes a mockery of any pretense of democracy. Not only has technocratic merit failed as a model of government, it has also narrowed the civic project. Today, the common good is mostly understood mainly in economic terms. It is less about cultivating solidarity or deepening bonds of citizenship than about satisfying consumer preferences as measured by gross domestic product. This makes for an unpublished public discourse, but I think it is a natural result of trends that predate it. Sandel. This is why having a longer, more materialistic view of the results of different periods of capitalism is really important. It actually explains, or at least gives context for, maybe you shouldn't say explain, that's too monocausal, how a lot of this happened and why this is the likely result of these prior policies that were much civically more responsible. But that's not all. Beyond hollowing out the public discourse, the reign of technocratic merit has reconfigured the terms of social recognition in ways that elevate the prestige of the credentialed professional classes and depreciate the contributions of most workers, eroding their social standing and esteem. This is the aspect of technocratic merit that contributes most directly to the angry, polarized politics of our time. And I think in some ways we have to deal with the fact that someone like Sandel, not a Marxist, not a radical at all. Like I said, he's kind of a left post-liberal communitarian with strong suspicions about the moral deregulations of markets and the impossibility of a neutral administrative state, as we talked about in discussing 2 other of his books, Markets and Morality and Democracy Discontent. We also see here, despite the fact he has a somewhat idealist view of the early American experiment that takes its intellectual justifications at face value, that those were better justifications for building civic virtue and solidarity. Now, they were also part of a degenerate racial project, etc. I mean, that's all true. And in some ways, you could accuse Sandel of not looking directly at that. But we have to be, to use a much abused term, dialectical when we look at these things. We have to see both their positives and their negatives and why those contradictions, why the positives and negatives of these social forms run into each other and cause some kind of shift when those things can no longer be reconciled in some key way. You know, that is the historical materialist view of history. These things contain contradictions, and by contradictions we mean countervailing tendencies, which cannot be reconciled. Something to deal with when we talk about morality and markets. We're going to deal a lot with this book. I think this is Sandel's most important book, and it's the one that kind of and Democracy's Discontent, with his new preface where he talks about crises, really do kind of give you what the communitarians are on about. We, from the socialist tradition, need to go more into the economics undergirding this, but not in a purely mechanistic, economistic way. There is a feedback loop here in the way ideas and economies socially reproduce each other. And we have to think about that. And the nominal left and the nominal right are often distractions from thinking about that. We want to be on the morally right side of this or that political divide and not look at why these things are happening. Morality be damned. As I've said many times, to conflate morality and politics this way does a disjustice to the understanding of either. Like and subscribe if you want more of these kinds of discussions, and I will be doing more traditional Marxological stuff and, everyone's favorite critical theory, high theory things. But I think some of you need to read outside of just purely psychoanalysis and purely things out of the left-wing cultural academic milieu. Those things could be confusing. Sometimes it's much more important to take a broader view and incorporate those broader views and compare them to what we're talking about. Have a great day.